The Liberty Forum enjoys a terrific reputation for holding programs that hope to foster the quality of lives by championing the principles of American liberty. Tonight, we offer this program in real hope that it just might actually save lives. Something strange has happened in our country. Our antennae are up as we witness the censorship, silencing, demonizing, and bullying of those with medical and policy positions that challenge the current path. Rather than a spirit of curiosity, our trust has been eroded by the endless drone of people posing as morally superior to us, with admonishments to follow science, while some science is, oddly, selectively ignored. It's audacious to demonstrate a lack of credibility and then demonize those who won't swallow whole your advice. Yet here we are. We at the Liberty Forum stand for the sanctity of independent thought. And tonight we give voice to those who are paying a tremendous price, much of it which we cannot see, for their willingness to dare share their expertise, the truth of what they see in their practices and research. No matter where your politics stand, we must all stand together for freedom of speech, or we will have uttered only a monologue of approved ideas. A living hell is proved by history and sadly, the state of millions living in tyranny around the world today. Our guests tonight are all highly educated, credentialed, awarded, cited, and respected in their careers. Please do look into their resumes and you'll be terribly impressed with their accomplishments. They have not only distinguished themselves in their fields, but often in their reputations as generous, caring citizens. Beyond the publications and significant positions they hold, included tonight are 2 Rotarians of the Year, which does not surprise me. So on deck tonight, Dr. Jay Bhattachara is a professor of medicine at Stanford University, where he earned both an MD and a PhD in economics. Co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, he challenged the wisdom and efficacy of lockdowns and brings rational debate to the profound socio and economic trade-offs we are making in the short and long term. Dr. George Fareed, a Harvard-educated physician with a background in research at both Harvard and the University of California, also spent some time at the NIH, where he crossed paths with Dr. Fauci. He holds 3 patents in the biotech field and was awarded the CMA Rural Physician of the Year in 2015. For the last 30 years, he has dedicated himself to the healthcare of the people of the Imperial Valley. He petitioned the Senate in November of 2020 with a plan to focus on early treatment, which he is successfully employing in his clinics. And we are delighted tonight to have with us an extra treat, and that is also to be joined by his colleague, Dr. Brian Tyson, who I welcome. They've collaborated together, working tirelessly on successful early treatment for over 10 months. Dr. Tyson is a family medicine specialist with some 20 years experience in the field. He founded in 2018 the All Valley Urgent Care in El Centro, California, where he and his team have taken care of over 4,500 COVID-19 patients in the past year. Dr. Jensen is the president and founder of the Catalyst Medical Clinic in the western suburbs of Minneapolis and also teaches at the University of Minnesota Medical School. He has just completed his term as a state senator in Minnesota, where he challenged the emergency powers of the governor and the quality of death statistics used by state authorities in the pandemic. With a stellar reputation as a caring and compassionate physician for over 40 years, Dr. Jensen is as resound as it gets in putting forth the truth in healthcare. We'll start with Jay on public policy and then hear from our 3 practicing physicians who bridge hands-on medicine and regulation. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by your Q&A. So we welcome you all. We're so glad to have you tonight, both in audience and as panelists. Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the idea of focus protection versus lockdown. In order to do that, I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to talk very briefly about what the mortality risk is from COVID. You'll hear later tonight how it could have been even better if we sort of worked on treatment, but I'm going to focus on what we saw. And then I'm going to talk about the evidence on lockdown harms, and I'm going to talk about a practical solution to the problem of COVID that we could implement immediately if we wanted to. So first, I want to talk about how deadly is COVID-19 infection. If you looked at, if you paid attention for early March, you might get the impression that it's incredibly deadly. The World Health Organization very famously put out an estimate in early March of last year saying that it was 3.4%. You know, 3 out of 100 people that get it, 3.5 out of 100 people that get it die from it. That estimate turns out to be vastly overstated, and for a very simple reason. Most of the people that are infected with COVID are never come to the attention of the public health because the symptoms are so mild. And so in early April of last year, I worked on a study called the Santa Clara Seroprevalence Study, actually a similar one in LA County, where we found that as of early April, 2.8% of Santa Clara County actually had already had evidence of having COVID. So that amounts to about 54,000 infections. At the time, there were only about 1,000 people identified with COVID and 100 deaths. If you work it out, that makes a case survival rate, that is, of the people who are identified with COVID by the public health authorities, of about 90%, 1 in 10 people dying from COVID, which sounds like a horrible, horrible disease, which would be. But in fact, if you account for the fact that there were 54,000 infections to date and 100 people died, actually the survival rate's more like 99.8%. So since that study, 100 such studies have been done around the world that have verified the same number. The survival rate from COVID is something on the order of 99.8%, 99.7%, something in that on that range. And it varies very much so by the age. For people who are over 70, the survival rate is something like 95%. And for people who are under 70, the survival rate is something on the order of 99.95%. If this shocks you, if it doesn't fit your impression, let me just assure you, there's, as I said, 100 such studies. This is grounded in the literature. There's a steep age gradient where older people are much more vulnerable to the harms of COVID than younger people are. As I said, later in the talks, you'll hear how we might have been able to do much better than this. But these are the numbers we actually have had to date on the survival rate from COVID. So keep that in your head. 99.8% survival with a steep age gradient. 95% for people over 70. 99.95% for people under 70. Okay, we've adopted lockdowns as the preferred strategy to reduce the spread of disease and protect people. We adopted those strategies without any thought whatsoever about the harms and costs that they in fact, in the early days, in March and April, if you were to bring up the idea that lockdowns have any cost whatsoever, you get shouted down as saying you only care about money, you don't care about lives. I want to change that impression. And in particular, I want to emphasize that lockdowns have had absolutely devastating effects on the health of populations around the world. So I'm going to start with a couple of examples, a couple of things from developing countries. Hunger and malnutrition. In April of last year, the UN World Food Program estimated that there would be an additional 130 million people who are at risk of starvation from the lockdown. 130 million people at risk of starvation from the lockdowns worldwide. This has actually been borne out by a study that was just published in Science Advances, following living standards during the COVID-19 crisis. And what they found, here's the main takeaway: household coping strategies and government assistance were insufficient to sustain pre-crisis living standards, resulting in widespread food insecurity and dire economic conditions even 3 months into the crisis. This is a study from 9 developing countries in Africa, Asia, elsewhere. The lockdowns have harmed every single poor person on the face of the earth. 80 million children at risk of diseases like diphtheria, measles, as COVID-19 disrupts routine vaccination. The lockdown harmed children, 80 million children around the world from routine vaccination efforts. Polio, which was about to be wiped off the face of the earth, has made a resurgence. In the United States, we've had missed healthcare. We've had people, you see stories that say we've had reduced cancer rates, but what's actually happened is not reduced cancer rates, but women skipping mammograms will see higher rates of stage 4 breast cancer as a consequence of people skipping mammograms. We'll see higher rates of colon cancer. The death toll from this is yet to be paid. 1 in 4 young adults last year, according to the CDC, seriously considered suicide. Imagine the depths of despair that implies. And that was in June. and the lockdowns continued. 1 in 4 young adults. And the benefits of lockdown have not been, to the extent that they exist, have been incredibly unequal. So I just pulled this from the LA County website on February 10th. In LA County, if you lived in Beverly Hills, in places with less than 10% poverty, you had a mortality rate of COVID of 93 per 100,000. If you lived in Compton, if you lived in poor parts of LA County, the death rate from COVID was 325 per 100,000, 3 times as high, more than 3 times as high. The lockdowns protected the rich. The lockdowns are a form of trickle-down epidemiology, and expose the poor, right? So the lockdowns actually are one of these things. If you care about equality at all, you should absolutely abhor it. The lockdowns, and I pulled this from LA County. We've been locked down basically continuously. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the lockdowns themselves represent an absolute a shocking revocation of our basic human rights to assembly, free speech, education. We've robbed our children. My children, my older son still can't go to school. He's still online. We've robbed we've taken away property rights. We've taken away due process rights. All these have sort of fallen by the wayside in the context of these lockdowns. Let me very quickly run through an example of Florida versus California, because I think it's instructive here. California and Florida closed roughly at the same time. California in early March, Florida in sort of the beginning of April. We saw the rise in cases, saw the 3.4% number. Both California and Florida closed. Freeways were empty in California. People were afraid that that if you drove too fast, the police were afraid that people would drive too fast just simply because the freeways were closed. Both California and Florida reopened with some restrictions in May. Disney World opened, but Disneyland stayed closed. Disney World opened, Disneyland stayed closed. In Florida, the beaches were open, but there were sort of people wandering around with looking like the Grim Reaper to remind people about how deadly COVID is. In September, early September, California implemented tiered restrictions, the tiers that we're currently in. Florida, famously on September 25th, fully reopened. On December 8th, California put in a very, very steep shelter-in-place order. What you're seeing here is the number of cases. The red is California, and the blue is Florida, the number of cumulative cases. So California puts in a shelter-in-place order while Florida is completely open. And yet the cases exploded in California and rose in Florida at the same rate, and at the same time. To date, California has now more COVID cases than Florida, and Florida has been open more or less continuously since May. Restaurants are open. The shelter-in-place order in California was finally lifted at the end of January, but the tiered lockdown basically means that we still lock down. Children are still not in school. If you look online, you can see these sort of I call it basically COVID porn. You can see people wandering around maskless, happy, smiling in places like Florida, and with these absolutely shocked reporters saying, "Oh my God, look at people actually living a normal life." What about deaths, you say? Well, Florida has had more deaths. That's true to date. California and Florida are actually pretty close. But remember, there's an age gradient in mortality. The people who are older are much more likely to die. California is the 7th youngest state. Florida is the 5th oldest state. And so when you adjust for that fact, the age-adjusted cumulative COVID deaths in Florida and California are nearly identical. And actually, the outcomes in Florida are more equal by race and by income level. We basically have had almost identical outcomes. California has slightly more cases, and California and Florida have had almost identical age-adjusted death rates, with more equal outcomes in Florida than in California, as far as deaths go. There's now a literature. This is a paper that I've written on the efficacy of lockdowns. Let me just read you the conclusion. While small benefits cannot be excluded, we don't find any significant benefits to the growth of more restricted NPIs or lockdowns. And similar reductions in case growth may be achieved with less restrictive interventions. Right? You don't need lockdowns to achieve control. And the California-Florida example sort of makes that clear. The California's regional stay-at-home orders were a costly failure. And you can see this in what's happened since. People continue to leave California in droves, whereas nearly 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida. people are moving to freedom and escaping the dystopia that California's become. What should we do? Well, focused protection is the right strategy. Protect the people we know to be vulnerable, the older population. And for the rest, lift the lockdowns, because the lockdowns are more harmful than COVID for the rest. That's the basic idea of the Great Barrington Declaration. The big pushback we got in Great Barrington Declaration was that it's not possible to protect the old. Well, you've seen it in Florida, the results are the same. Even though they're an older state, they've actually protected the old. California lockdown has not protected the old. Lockdowns don't serve to protect the old. If you want to protect the old, you actually have to work to protect the old. And now with the vaccines, we have a perfect way to do that, right? And so Florida has prioritized vaccinating nursing homes where 40% of the deaths have occurred, and actually worked to protect the old. Now California has started to catch up in this, which is actually probably the first good thing I've seen to come out of California COVID policy. There's a lot we could have done, and you'll hear from the next speakers about what more we should have and could have done regarding early treatment. And I think that all that it makes good sense. But the lockdowns, I think we should never do again. They failed to do what they were supposed to do, and in many ways have caused harm to the poor around the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhattachara. What was the expression you used? Trickle down
epidemiology. Trickle down epidemiology. That's that's the policy we have. We're supposed to protect. Yeah.
That says a lot. Thank you so much. We now welcome to the floor Dr. George Fareed and Dr. Brian Tyson, who have recently co-authored a landmark article on the early outpatient treatment of COVID-19. They have treated somewhere, as we said, around 5,000 cases of COVID so far, and are truly doing God's work to save lives in the Imperial Valley. What they need is more hands on deck. The generosity, dedication, and kindness of these men in their battle to save lives is simply remarkable. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege. Can you see me? Okay, I'm going to give the slides with Brian commenting, and then going over the major points at the end, which we'd like to address. But we just want to compliment Jay and his heroic and landmark work on this, and presented so beautifully in that on not condoning lockdowns and the harm that's been done. We've seen that. And what Brian and it's been an honor to be associated with Brian in the history when it's written. His urgent care clinic and approach will be recognized and will be hopefully a model for what will be done in the future, because from what he set up and what I was able to be a part of and continue to be a part of, we're actually at one of his urgent care clinics right now, did result in 5,000 or more Valley residents here resolving their COVID-19 effectively with early treatment. And I want to just talk about a few of the treatments that we're in favor of, and right now there are a number of repurposed agents, and Steve would talk about fluvoxamine, which is also one of the really promising agents. But we started off with what we had available, and that was hydroxychloroquine. And the next few slides show the really phenomenal, irrefutable evidence of the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine when used within the first few days or up to the first week of the COVID-19 infection. And I would like to just mention that it's now from 8 meta-studies, the evidence through November indicates that it is effective or it's estimated that 1 in 19 quadrillion would be the likelihood of it not being effective. So it's really a tremendous agent, and that's what we have found in 5 to 6 months of using that as a major backbone of our treatment in the outpatient setting and in a nursing home experience, which we've had in the Imperial Valley. The next slide. Keone, would you change the slide, please? Thank you. So these are 26 studies that show the efficacy improvements seen in early application. The next slide. And this is a more of the extensive chronological setting or sequence of studies that led to that number that I mentioned, that all the green is the very positive results. And when it's analyzed statistically, the chance of it not being effective is 1 in 19 quadrillion. The next slide. And this again is a breakdown of different studies. In the results on the left in green show numbers of studies in early treatment. They're all efficacious. As treatment is used late, there are many other studies that aren't effective, where it isn't effective, where it isn't appropriate. And if one looks at the pathophysiology of the COVID-19 infection, one can understand why that would be the case. In pre and post-exposure prophylaxis studies, there are a number that show efficacy for those purposes. And all studies in some give the result that's shown at the bottom line, with the green findings being the efficacious results, more than 66% of the time. The next slide. And really more dramatically is what's seen in population studies where HCQ has been employed in many countries which couldn't afford modern approaches and expensive medical interventions, and use the very inexpensive repurposed or generic hydroxychloroquine. Death rates per million are far better than they are in the Western world, and particularly in the United States, with in those using it early, an average of 367 deaths per million is seen, whereas in the United States and Western world, it's 1,220 deaths per million. The next slide. So all of this has evolved into designing treatments that Brian and I have employed and that we've been guided on through the great insights of Peter McCullough and Vladimir Zelenko, particularly Raoult in France, and then an article that is published now with an algorithm in which a sequential employment of the agents is recommended and described. And it incorporates the nutraceuticals. The next slide, please. I'm going to come to this in just a second, but it employs the use of nutraceuticals, monoclonal antibodies now, and these repurposed agents that are antiviral in action, such as ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and probably fluvoxamine. And one can use them in combinations. And that, in fact, for the last 4 or 5 months, Brian and I have felt has been the most effective, where we use ivermectin along with hydroxychloroquine. This is a slide that that Peter McCullough developed on the pillars of pandemia. And Joel Hirschhorn, whose book I'm going to show in a minute about the blunder of the pandemic, puts that early home pillar at the beginning. But there are 4 pillars: the early home treatment, and I agree with him that it should be the first pillar, and it should have been taken by Fauci and the NIH and CDC and public health departments as the big thrust of everything in March and April and May of last year, in order to come up with solutions and to bring hope to people and to prevent hospitalization. And that's what the goal of Dr. Brian Tyson and mine has been through the pandemic. In any case, so there are the pillars. Are Hirschhorn would say the second pillar is contagion control, and that's all that we've been told to do. Use masks, use social distancing, wait it out. And if you beat it out on your own, you don't have to go to the hospital. If you don't, you end up with severe consequences and undoubtedly the long COVID syndrome. And then finally, late stage hospitalization, the safety net for survival. And I'm a hospitalist, so and Brian has been illustrious hospitalist in the past, and I've seen the whole spectrum, the evolution into that horrible cytokine storm and long-term ventilatory support and death. And then finally, herd immunity, which we're entering into, and which is the consequence of what Jay was referring to, a lot of asymptomatic cases, a lot of immunity spread throughout the communities, and no effective vaccines at this particular time. Maybe down the road, they'll have an effect on that. I hope they will. The next slide. So then that's the science of COVID-19, the early phase of between 7 to 10 days of viral proliferation, the bad flu syndrome. That's when we need to attack it, and should have been attacking it 10 months ago. And they still don't come around with giving us credence, and unfortunately, the vast majority of physicians practicing on the front line were not asked to investigate this or offer it, and they were scared of it for different reasons. And then subsequently, the thrombolytic problems and cytokine injury. The next slide. And that's the algorithm. And it was actually published in August and now formally published in a peer-reviewed journal in December. The next slide, and Brian may talk about some aspects of that. I have one quick slide on home kits that are offered around the world, except the United States, where they're offered hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin and doxycycline and zinc and vitamin D, but they're given that off the shelf so they can get themselves under treatment at home without waiting. The next slide. And now there's several peer-reviewed studies that are, and Brian's is going to come out soon, and maybe he could comment about it, but this is a terrific one from Brian Proctor in Texas, and it shows the multifaceted treatment with HCQ and ivermectin, azithromycin, doxycycline, and nutraceuticals and budesonide. And the first one to lead the way was that of Dr. Zelenko and Dorman from Germany in August, I believe, or September. But these are peer-reviewed studies, and these should have been extolled by the Public Health Department and by the NIH, and they don't get enough recognition, but they're 88% reduction in hospitalization and 61% risk reduction in death. And in this, Brian, why don't you comment about the 5,000 patients?
Yeah, so I mean, we took the same kind of approach, which I think we've missed as physicians who have all practiced medicine, which is there's been no other condition that I've been taught in med school that says wait until you need to be hospitalized to treat. I don't care what kind of process you're looking at, whether it's pneumonia or cancer or liver disease or diabetes. Nobody says, wait until you're so sick that you need to go to the hospital before you get the first evidence of treatment. Now, what we realized is we've been treating patients since March of last year. And it started with what's available. Then we started adding what works. So we started using, the Zelenko protocol. We added ivermectin, we added steroids. I started doing chest x-rays, and we started to find these inflammatory conditions. That already led me into almost like an asthma-like treatment with dexamethasone, budesonide, albuterol, home oxygen. Reevaluation was one of our big keys. Our ability to see patients in person helped us identify and prevent the hospitalizations and prevent the deaths on those patients who needed an extended treatment. So of the 4,500 patients that we've seen extremely sick patients. I've seen, ARDS on my chest x-rays that the radiologists are calling me, telling me, you better get this guy in the clinic or in the hospital. Patients who've refused to go to the hospital, we've treated them with home oxygen. It's just been a very aggressive, multifaceted, multi-drug approach. And that has made all the difference in the world. George alluded to early treatment has been the mainstay of most of our modern medicine. And to skip that and just go straight into wait till you're hospitalized even goes against the monoclonal antibody treatment, which says you can't get monoclonal antibody if you're on oxygen. So that even goes against the NIH guidelines saying we don't recommend treatment until you need oxygen, which means you can't even get the monoclonal antibody treatment.
Good. Could I go to the next slide? Sorry to cut you off if I did. Okay. So this is a great book. I highly recommend it. Joe Hirshhorn's book, Pandemic Plunder. It documents everything we've been saying pretty much so. Fauci and public health blocked early home COVID treatment. The next slide. So now just the key points we wanted to make, and there are 4 of them that are summarized here. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so number 1, we are seeing fewer cases consistent with herd immunity. We've seen a dramatic drop across our aspect of seeing patients, and even across the nation. And this is independent of a vaccine.
Next slide. So again, the call for RCT randomized trials and blocking early treatment of NIH have cost hundreds of thousands of lives that shouldn't have been lost, and fivefold the number of suffering, very horrible experiences with coming out of it with injuries that they have probably years to recover from. And there's not a single study of early treatment on high-risk patients using cocktails that has refuted early treatment. Not a single study that suggests early treatment is not safe. Next slide.
Yeah, so even with the vaccine, early treatment's still going to be needed. We clearly don't have enough vaccines to vaccinate the whole world. We still don't know whether these vaccines are effective. You're hearing from Fauci saying, even if you've been vaccinated twice, you're still going to need to wear masks. You're still need to social distance. You're still going to need to do all the same things. We are actually seeing patients testing positive and sick with COVID even after being vaccinated.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also fail to address the fact that people that have recovered from COVID-19 are far better immunized than the vaccine can ever achieve. That they don't need to get exposed to this vaccine, and they won't really benefit from it. They'll remain with strong immunity undoubtedly for 10 or 12 months. Next slide. So there really, I think Brian shares with me that there needs to be a reckoning and accountability for what has occurred. We wouldn't have had to deal with lockdown issues and all the consequences that many of those things that Jay mentioned in his great talk tonight, but there has to be sort of an M&M post-mortem approach, and our system has been exposed as being broken, and the answer is not vaccines, but we feel strongly it's in early treatment. Thank you very much. Oops, another thing. Okay. And now there's clear science and pathophysiology. It needs to be well understood, and generally doctors widely need to be familiar with it. And they need to act upon it in the interest of their patients. And that's what's been failed to happen, unfortunately, in the fragmented medical care that we have in the United States. Failure of treating COVID was not listening to the scientists like Dr. Rao and Dr. Zelenko and McCullough, who combined science with good medical care. Thank you.
Thank you both so very much. I want to share with the audience that I happen to know that both of those doctors have been ringing the bell since early this morning. They have been trying to get the word out. I know they work often 7 days a week to see patients, and I just thank you both for being with us tonight and sharing this. It's very moving.
Thank you, Jane.
And 1 in 19 quadrillion is a number that's going to stay with me forever. I don't really know what a quadrillion is, but I'm going to try to ponder that after the program. Something doesn't pass the smell test when we have all those countries that you listed having treatment home kits, and the United States of America has no available treatment. Doesn't make sense. Oh, next, Dr. Scott Jensen, welcome. Scott Jensen comes to this battlefield in 3 uniforms, actually: that of doctor, government official, having just finished his term as a state senator, and as a COVID-19 patient. Oh, I'd love to hear some more about what happened to him. I hope he'll share with you about what happened with the medical board in Minnesota, but we may hear more from Scott soon, as many are hoping that he will throw his hat into the ring and run for the governor of Minnesota. It's not surprising to those of us who recognize a man with an intact moral compass that Minnesota nice turns out to be Minnesota strong. Dr. Jensen?
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you to everyone joining us tonight. And I want to say that I am humbled by the chance to share this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I would start out with the word diets, D-I-E-T-S. That's oftentimes how I frame my remarks when I talk about COVID-19. We have seen a willingness to corrupt data at a level I've never seen before. For me, that started in early April when the Minnesota Department of Health sent out a communication indicating that we were to, if you will, change the rules by which we complete death certificates. For the first time in my 35 years, I was being advised that if I thought something was probable or presumptive, or perhaps more likely than not, that it'd be okay to go ahead and utilize that for the underlying cause of death. The CDC's own guidelines that have been in place for more than 17 years ask physicians to identify the initiating event in a sequence of events that would lead to someone's demise. Clearly, we've always been taught that a causation sequence is critical. Frequently, the initiating event will be something that might have happened a year or two or even more earlier. It might have been the diagnosis of colon cancer, which was already metastasized and ended up being the initiating event. It could be something like a severe stroke. But regardless, in this communication from the Department of Health in Minnesota, I was advised that if COVID-19 was felt to be a contributing condition, it should be utilized as the cause of death. But, oh, by the way, if asthma or emphysema or something like that was considered to be a contributing condition, then for heaven's sakes, put it in part 2, relegate it to something not in the sequence of events leading to the death. That was where it started. Following that, I ended up learning how it is to be attacked by bureaucrats and politicians and colleagues, which is particularly hurtful, but also mainstream media, and then ultimately the Board of Medical Practice in Minnesota. Both in late June and in late August, I was investigated and had to go through the challenging and painful process of defending myself against anonymous accusers whose complaint was that I had had the audacity to compare COVID-19 to influenza outbreaks and pandemics, and that I also was a danger to public health because I had, again, tried to provide context for what we were going through in COVID-19. The preceding speakers have laid the groundwork, if you will, that we can all understand the context. But when I tell people that in 2018, we had 80,000 people die of influenza, and we didn't close down schools, lock down businesses, and frankly, it barely registered a blip on the radar screen, people are shocked. When I tell people that 3 million Americans die every year, and that 1 out of every 100 Americans die every year, people sort of raise an eyebrow and say, well, I didn't know that. So I think providing context is a great way to help people think for themselves. So we've seen data corruption. We've seen an invasion of our rights. In Minnesota, our governor single-handedly decided to send out to some 500 law enforcement agencies the addresses of all Minnesotans who had active COVID-19 in their households. His rationale was this way, first responders would know where they need to be careful because that household would be, quote, infectious. Well, that's silly. You always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. We knew that for every case that had been identified, for every household that had been identified, there would be at least 10 more. And in some statistical situations, 50 more households that would indeed be infectious. It made no sense at all. And that's why the ACLU came against our governor and said, this is bad policy. This happened time and again in terms of having our rights invaded. We actually saw something so sad as our governor put in place an executive order instructing the Board of Pharmacy to advise all pharmacies that they were not to dispense the medications prescribed by physicians if it was for hydroxychloroquine. That order went in place quietly in late March, and just as quietly in mid-August, it was rescinded. No explanation given. We saw an expansion of government in an unprecedented manner. Being in the legislature, I saw our governor every 30 days renew his executive powers because he knew that the Democratic House of Representatives would not go against him. And so he was able to circumvent the legislative and the judiciary branches and put in place, if you will, executive orders that smelled and looked exactly like legislation, but he would never be able to get it done through normal legislative channels. We saw our seniors in long-term care facilities terrorized as some of our governor's policies created a pipeline of active COVID-19 disease right into the long-term care facilities. These facilities were not allowed to do the things that they would have liked to have done to try to keep active COVID-19 disease out of their walls. Instead, a pipeline was created. And once COVID-19 invaded a facility, what happened? But the facility was locked down, the residents were locked in, the families were locked out, and people died horrifically and alone. We saw a terrorizing of our students as the collateral damage from school closures, which has already been discussed tonight, was humongous. In my career, I have never seen so much suicide and so many kids come in and talk about maybe it would be better if they just ended things. We saw small businesses terrorized. In Minnesota, we saw candy stores identified as essential. Liquor stores were essential. But the hardware store that might have had 12 customers in an entire day was non-essential. Churches were non-essential. The one place where people might somehow gather the strength to stay positive was closed down to them. And lastly, science. We saw science peddled in a almost hucksterism kind of fashion by bureaucrats and politicians who pandered to the whims of public opinion. Even now we're seeing that. We're seeing Governor Cuomo finally confessing that yes, he fudged the numbers when it came to long-term care facility deaths. We've seen Governor Newsom in California come out and say, well, the CDC says we can open up our schools now. Really? He's seen the light. We've seen it in our state, a certain pandering to public opinion, but yet 12 and 14-year-old kids that are playing sports have to wear masks, unless you wrestle. If you wrestle, you don't wear a mask. If you play hockey, you do. Science has been absolutely impeached. We find ourselves at a place, and Jane, you mentioned it earlier, you used the word strange. Many of us think that we've fallen asleep and awakened in the middle of a Twilight Zone episode. A year ago, we couldn't have imagined that our country could be in the place we are. And yet here we are. I think we all worry that we've gone to a place where we'll never be able to quite rebound back to where we were. That these kinds of draconian, silly policy decisions might be repeated again and again. We've seen scientific data accumulated over the last 3 decades, chucked in the matter of weeks or months. We've seen people like Fauci and Osterholm tell people, for heaven's sakes, don't wear a mask, it doesn't do any good, only to reverse themselves and to become so passionate about the value of masks. They remind me of first century disciples evangelizing after the death of Jesus. It's unbelievable how we have seen the pandering and the hucksterism. The only way we're going to get through this is for brave people to engage across the land, across the globe, and say, no, we will not allow this to happen. This is the least of us. This is the worst of us. We can be better than this. And the only way we can do that is to remember the words of Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. Thank you, Jane.
Well, we want to move to the Q&A now. We've got a lot of questions, as I knew we would. We have a really active audience here at the Liberty Forum. Can we go a little bit further into the vaccine? It's kind of the elephant in the living room. Can you speak to the effectiveness of the vaccine? The dangers are out there, the mRNA mechanism, what it does to our bodies long-term, and potential risk to developing fetuses. We'd love to hear all of that.
Okay, so I can try to start on that. I mean, I think that the vaccine The trial data to date, so let me just describe the mechanisms of the mRNA. There's several other vaccines, but the two that have been approved in the US use this mRNA vaccine. The way that the mRNA vaccine works is it takes a snippet of the virus's genome from the RNA, a snippet of it, and then puts it in this vesicle that then your cells take up after it's injected, and it produces the protein that's expressed on a cell that has that vaccine in it. And then trains your immune system to attack that spike protein. It doesn't produce it's not a live virus. It doesn't make you sick. The mRNA itself is destroyed after it's produces the spike protein. The data on the vaccine to date, from looking at the trials, suggests to me that the vaccine is very, very effective at reducing symptomatic COVID. And reducing like the likelihood of hospitalization and death. It's as best I can tell, a good vaccine, good enough that I told my mom, who's 80, to take it, and she's taken it, and it's actually a relief to me that she did. My wife, who's a physician, also took it, and it's a relief to me that she did, because she treats patients that are potentially vulnerable. And I'll take it when it's my turn. I think that the vaccine hasn't been tested on children. And we shouldn't be recommending its use in children. There's a question about long-term use. The vaccine to date has been evaluated for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 months, something like that. It's not possible to answer the long-term side effects of the vaccine based on the evaluations we have now. I mean, that's just a fact. To me, my recommendation for taking it has to do with the fact that I think that COVID in older populations actually is quite deadly. And relative to that, the vaccine is a much safer risk than COVID in that population. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's the basis of my recommendation for it. And why same thing. Now, if early treatment, if the data on early treatment, are so good, then I'll change my recommendation. But I think the question is, what's the right thing to do to address COVID? Is we have to do something on the vulnerable, and you got to follow the data. To date, the vaccines look like it looks like it's effective so I think that's the idea. It's always a balance of risk.
An interesting thing, Jay, because there's a lot of, I hear what you're saying, and certainly you're the medical authority. But I think it's odd that we are calling this a vaccine instead of an experimental vaccine. Does that strike you as odd in terms of your research history? Do we call things vaccines when they actually don't prevent infection or spread?
So I think there's a misconception around that. I think it's quite likely that the vaccines reduce spread of the disease because it reduces symptomatic disease. And I think that if you're asymptomatic or have very few symptoms, you're very unlikely to spread the disease. I mean, there's a lot of contact tracing data to suggest that. So just take the two pieces of logic together. The vaccine prevents symptomatic disease, and only symptomatic people really spread the disease. Asymptomatic people spread it at very, very low rates. If you put those together, I think the vaccine actually does reduce the spread of the disease. Now, the trials did not look at that fact. So you can't say that the trials proved that fact. But my prior, based on what I've seen on those two facts, if you put those together, is that it's very, very likely that it reduces the spread of the disease.
But there's been almost 900 deaths reported in the various systems. So I would disagree. So I would disagree with the analysis that the vaccine is safe. I would also disagree that this is actually a vaccine. I would also just say that this is a gene therapeutic, not necessarily a vaccine. Vaccines typically by nature, like example, polio, right? You don't get a small case of polio. The vaccine protects you from getting polio. If you give a live attenuated vaccine or you give a killed vaccine, okay, those are actual viral particles. This is not a viral particle. This is a gene therapeutic. And so I think we need to call it what it is and say that this is experimental. It's new. We've never seen it before. So I would agree that yes, there are certain very narrow spectrum of the population that probably should get the vaccine, but I can tell you that there are large groups who do not need this vaccine. Number one, anyone who has not been tested for the vaccine should not get it, i.e. kids under the age of 16, pregnant women, lactating women. Let's keep them out of it. How about people who have already had COVID? Let's get them. They don't need the vaccine. Clearly, they have natural immunity. So those definite high populations of people do not need this vaccine or experimental vaccine. And I think that's really what we should probably be saying, is more the gene therapeutic. And I have seen personally harsh reactions to this vaccine coming into the urgent care with symptoms that are worse than COVID in the age groups to which they're coming in. I've seen 19-year-olds, I've seen nurses, I've seen doctors coming in and they get treatment with us who've had the vaccine, and those symptomatologies for those age groups are more severe, especially after the second dose, okay, compared to what we would normally expect in that age group for getting COVID itself. So I'm a little leery. I'm still a little leery on this vaccine, and that's just my personal experience with it. But again, I've seen close to 4,500 positive patients. So I would use that as a pretty good leverage. I pretty much know what I'm talking about, and I would still advise with strong caution about getting the vaccine and making sure you absolutely need it before getting it.
Thank you. What is so tremendous about the forum is that we can have a conversation where people have differing opinions and we don't shout each other down and we don't cancel each other. And I am so honored to be part of this group for that. One question from the audience.
One very quick in response. I agree with Dr. Tyson about the groups that they haven't been tested for it. All the ones he said that haven't been tested should not get the vaccine until it's been tested in them at least. And even then, you have to do the balance of risks. And I also agree about the previous natural infection. If you have been infected before, you are immune most likely, or certainly protected against reinfection. And so if you're going to get the vaccine, at all, wait. Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think there's less disagreement than is apparent.
So 2 out of 5 of you have actually had COVID. And one of the questions from the audience is, what did you take and what did you do?
When I got sick, I immediately started my hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, Zithromax. I was already taking zinc and vitamin C. And my symptoms lasted about 3 days, and I was over the illness.
And Dr. Jensen?
My symptoms were basically ragweed allergies. I felt stuffy nose, sneezing, a little bit of cough, and I didn't think much of it, but because typically at the end of August, which is when I contracted COVID-19, I usually get ragweed symptoms. And it wasn't until a month later that I ran into someone else who told me that they had COVID-19 at that time. We'd been together, and then a few days later I had my symptoms. And that sort of clarified why my ragweed season was so short. Normally it lasts 3 or 4 weeks until the first frost in Minnesota. But in this situation, everything was gone in 5 to 7 days. So then I had my antibodies checked, and sure enough, I had converted to positive. I had been negative in May and negative in July, and then I was positive in September, and then positive in December. And then the blood bank one, I went to them and said, do you want to use my blood for plasma, convalescent plasma? And they said, yeah. And so they've used that a couple of times, and they said I had the neutralizing antibodies and everything they wanted. But interestingly enough, after I had donated my plasma, then my neutralizing antibodies dropped below the threshold they wanted. I continued to have different antibodies. So now they don't want my plasma for convalescent plasma until possibly I regenerate enough antibody to get to that threshold level, if indeed I would do that. So it's a little bit of a learning process too.
So it's interesting. There's a question about the audience member says, which one are the monoclonal vaccines? But I think she's referring to the monoclonal antibodies. Does anybody want to talk about those? Because they seem very promising and successful. We haven't heard much about them tonight.
They're actually pretty good treatment. You mean like the Regeneron monoclonal antibodies? They're good treatment, and they're pretty. I mean, for reasons I don't understand, they're underused. But I mean, that's just because you've heard from the panelists that the early treatments have been just underused as a general rule. I don't really know why.
Jay, can I just ask you? I'm sitting here as a layperson, and I think the rest of us probably are too. Underused. We hear these stories of these things sitting in the basements of hospitals, not.
Yeah, and I've actually tried to get the monoclonal antibody at my urgent care because we do IV infusions. And I have sent 6 different emails. I've talked to the head of the public health here. I've talked to the state. I've talked to the state pharmacy, and I still can't get the monoclonal antibody here at my urgent care. We are left to sending patients to the ER and hope that they quote qualify, hope that the wait times aren't 6 or 7 hours to get it, hope that the patient sticks around, and we're left to, we don't know what happens to the patients when they go over there.
Yeah, let's talk about vitamin D3. What are the supplements that people are asking? What are the supplements they can take over the counter? What can people do at home to strengthen their own health? What's effective?
Well, the vitamin D3 is an excellent one, 4 to 10,000 units a day, or 4 to 5,000 units a day, I would say. And quercetin or EGCG that are 500 milligrams daily of one or the other that are ionophores, zinc, elemental 25 milligrams daily, vitamin C 1,000 milligrams daily, and a good multivitamin in addition.
So I understand it takes vitamin D 2 weeks to get loaded in your system. So this is nothing you can start at the hospital. This has to be done ahead of time, right? And it does reduce the deaths in the hospital if you do not have a vitamin D deficiency. Is that accurate, doctors?
That is correct. And the studies have shown that those who were vitamin D deficient did worse in hospitalizations. And that's where that whole D3 supplementation.
I put a link to some of the evidence on that in the Q&A. That's absolutely right.
Let's see what else is here. I really want to get to all these questions. There was a big fuss yesterday about the 500,000 deaths. The audience member says, how many of those were old comorbidities? Are these false statistics?
I'd like to take a shot at that question, Jane. Just recently, data was released in Minnesota demonstrating that more than 40% of our long-term care facility deaths and their correlated death certificates, more than 40% had only one diagnosis on the Part A, and that was COVID-19. That begs the question, more and more we use nursing homes, long-term care facilities more restrictively just because of societal changes. In nursing homes themselves, people that frequently go to nursing homes, not to rehab a joint replacement, but as their last domicile, they're typically in the nursing home 12 to 18 months before passing away. So they're fairly ill. They're fairly compromised from a health perspective. So why would more than 40% of these people who die have only one diagnosis on their death certificate? I think it speaks to several things. It's very likely that physicians are doing a little bit of a sloppy job on it. It may be that the medical director in certain nursing homes are doing a lot of them. But the fact of the matter remains that if you're in a nursing home and you have a likelihood of passing away in the next 12 to 15 months, there's most likely diagnoses that you suffer from that are impacting on your health and may have already initiated the sequence of events that's going to lead to your demise. It might be severe chronic renal, it might be end-stage renal failure. It might be severe dementia. It could be profound congestive heart failure. But I think we continue to see the distortion and corruption of what normally physicians have held themselves to a high standard on, and that's quality of data. And I think so when we see 500,000 deaths, how many of those really had a different underlying cause of death? And COVID might have been the tipping point. It might have been the immediate cause of death, but it wasn't the all-important underlying cause of death. So I think that's why I've called for in Minnesota an audit. And I think every state should audit itself in a nonpartisan way so that we really know what we're dealing with. And we also know that there have been, not necessarily with death certificates, but in terms of hospital discharges and hospitalizations, if you reach a certain threshold of patients that were admitted and had COVID-19 as one of their diagnoses, if you met those thresholds between January 1 and June 10th, 2020, in the first high impact distribution of the CARES Act money, you had to hit 161. If you hit 161 admissions with COVID-19 diagnosis, you got $77,000 more per admission on top of what that hospital was already paid. In many hospitals, this would amount to $20 to $25 million. So we know that there may well have been some perverse incentives that were created along the way through government policies.
It's kind of breathtaking to hear this tonight. I want to make sure that we hit the question that is at everyone's heart. How do I get a hold of these early treatments? In California, and to our listeners across the country, maybe even the world, what can people do if they get diagnosed? How do they get it, doctors?
So there's a couple of sites that people could write down. Number one is the American Frontline Doctors at aflds.com. There's a group of physicians that will do telemedicine and get those treatments out to you. Another is one of my colleagues is myfreedoctor.com. And that also is nationwide. Here in California, you can look us up at All Valley Urgent Care. We're in El Centro and in Brawley, and we also distribute, via telemedicine, the medications.
My highest recommendation, I think those are very good, is www.vladimirzelenkomd.com. VladimirZelenkomd.com. Zelenko is the hero for Brian and me and for our country, and really in terms of early treatment with a hydroxychloroquine cocktail, azithromycin and zinc. But he is a wonderful doctor, just doing telemedicine now. He's battling cancer and doing well with that. But I would highly recommend anyone go to his website online and have telemedicine with Dr. Zelenko.
Okay. Boy, we could keep you guys all night, but I won't do that to you. But I want to combine a few questions here. From one of our listeners I was emailed, there's a shocking amount of information, suppression from the media, big tech, big farm. For instance, Merck denying that ivermectin is a potential early treatment that's safe and effective for COVID. Doctors who want to have these discussions are understandably worried about their reputations and their medical licenses. Yet, to get back to our lives as normal, we need more public awareness about ivermectin, vitamin D, zinc, fluoxamine, melatonin, hydroxychloroquine, and the others. What can we as individuals do to help and where can patients go for these early treatments?
I think that's the key, is to get the word out, to get the public informed, and to get the movement among the physicians that are a broad base of physicians to encourage the use of these early treatments and be creative and individualize to provide the best treatment for each individual patient. But there's a need for publication more, and to get our people in the NIH, FDA, CDC to really stand up and do what they should have done long ago. That may be a wishful dream of mine or hope, but that's without that, we can do it hopefully by speaking out like we're doing tonight.
Pardon me. Also, a lot of these links will be posted, probably not tonight, but tomorrow, on the Liberty Forum website, so you'll be able to get the information there. I want to ask one specific question, because my heart's really going out to this person who's asking this question, and then I think we'll close with some more general comments from you guys, anything left that you haven't shared, and that is this. This is from a listener who says, my 98-year-old mother received both Pfizer injections and did not experience any reactions 2 weeks post second injection. Given the choices are now for Pfizer and Moderna, is it suggested to insist on one gene therapy over another based on your parents' DNA? So now we've got multi-generational questions. Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I don't know any direct evidence on that.
Okay.
So there's no way to answer that from the literature, but I'd say, well, why not? If one worked for your mom, use the same one, just from a prudence point of view.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Is there anything you guys think could be done to move the state and federal government agencies to allow doctors and the public to choose some of these treatments? Is there a specific thing that you think we can do to move the government?
There's an act that's passing through, like some people just proposed through Congress called I think it's called the TREAT Act, Temporary Reciprocity to Ensure Access to Treatment Act. Maybe you can write your congressman and try to get that get that passed, or things like that. I mean, I think generally the inability of doctors to work across state lines was bad before COVID. Now there's really no good reason for it.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, it's really clear to me that we could have done a conference, not just a program tonight. And I'm so appreciative. The amount of information that you gave was super helpful. We so appreciate you being with us. So I'd like to offer each of you a chance to share any final thoughts, including anything that maybe you shared, you answered. Some of you, I see that you've answered some questions online. So if there's something really important that you'd like us to know, if you would close with that.
This is the single biggest public health disaster in history, bar none. And it was, a lot of it was entirely preventable, because it's not just the COVID deaths, the lockdown deaths we should not forget. We have jumped to the lockdown as if it were the only tool we have to address the epidemic. It I think largely failed to protect anybody from dying from COVID. And it itself has caused absolutely enormous collateral damage. We decided that the only focus of public health should be infection control. We've forgotten that there's a million other important things for human flourishing that are needed in public health that we should have been focusing on, and we've forgotten the world's poor in the context of these lockdowns. In the panic and the fear which have basically been part of the policy that we followed, we've created enormous collateral damage. And what I hope that we come out of this as a world is that lockdown becomes a dirty word. That if anyone ever mentions it, we sort of put them to shame, because it has been such a disaster. We can do better, I hope, next time.
Thank you.
And if I could piggyback on top of Jay's comments.
Please.
First off, if anybody in the audience has not had a chance to read the Great Barrington Declaration, which Dr. Bhattachara was one of the authors, you certainly should. And I want to thank you, Jay, for your courage and your thoughtfulness in putting that together. I think that within an hour after I had read it, I had signed on. I think I might have been the first Minnesota doctor to have signed it, but it is so well written. It is so put together. I just want to highlight one concern I have, and that's after 35 years in medicine, I find a chasm, a fracture has occurred in my profession that I could never have guessed would occur. I have physician colleagues have come against me, and a few years ago I was honored to be the family doctor of the year in Minnesota, and I've never had this kind of vitriol come my way, but I've not tried to tell any physicians what they should or shouldn't do when they're in an exam room with the patient. It's between the patient and the physician. And the notion that physicians would come against me because I wanted to prescribe hydroxychloroquine or use budesonide is anathema. And yet that's where we're at. There's physicians on social media that say I've dishonored the profession of medicine because I'm willing to speak against a, quote, conventional narrative. Medicine is going to have to regroup and grow up again. And we're going to have to remember that it isn't about plugging a patient into an algorithm. It's about having a conversation with a patient and encouraging and empowering them to be their own best champion. Because every patient is unique with a different set of values and a different set of hopes and dreams. And so I feel so sad how the medical profession, especially in the United States, has really dropped a few steps on the ladder, and we're not really serving patients.
Dr. Jensen, I would imagine most people would love to be your patient after they just heard that, and maybe your constituent if you become the governor of Minnesota. Drs. Fareed and Tyson, would you like to offer some closing words, please?
Let me offer a couple of comments to let Brian finish up for us, in that Back in May, end of May, Harvey Reich published a great article. We were working in the urgent care clinic, and it expressed exactly what we were doing, early treatment. He pleaded for early treatment to be rolled out, and there were 50,000 deaths at that time. And he was absolutely right. And what we haven't learned from all the findings around the world and beyond the United States. And one great example is Saudi Arabia. They have a universal health care. They have fever clinics throughout the country. And they published a great article of 8,000 patients. Half of them got HCQ, the other half didn't. Everyone was treated with the standard of care, and the death rate was 80% reduced in those that received hydroxychloroquine. Brian set up the fever clinic model that should have been utilized around our country. And at some point he'll be revered for that and be able to teach how that should be done. But at this time, I know of no other urgent care physician, head, and facility that did what should have been done at the urgent care setting, where it could really have made a difference in this pandemic.
Well, thank you, George, for that. Yeah, I'm really honored to be a part of everybody here, and just listening to the passion that everyone has, and the discourse that this country's taken in its approach to trying to head a pandemic. You know, it's mind-boggling to me that we've lost our common sense with things. I mean, if we really take a step back and truly look from an outside looking in, we've lost our ability to rhyme and reason, and instead we've replaced it with politics, which I just cannot stand. If somebody says, well, I prescribe hydroxychloroquine, well, then you must be Republican. If I'm against hydroxychloroquine, then you must be Democrat. Like we've got to get away from that, and medicine needs to be left out of politics. You know, we're destroying our kids. I have kids in kindergarten, in 7th grade. I have kids in college. I have a kid in high school who's got Down syndrome and he's special needs. And these kids have been left out of the entire conversation across the world, in all of these countries, that there's nobody's talking about the effects that are having on these kids. Zoom classes for an entire year. I mean, that's ridiculous. We talk about vaccines, we talk about early treatment, we talk about everything, but we have not talking about the kids who have lost graduation, the kids who aren't playing football, the kids who aren't getting scholarships, the kids who are dropping out, the drug use rates that are going up, the suicide rates that are going up, the depression, the anxiety. Mm-hmm. All of those things are a result of piss poor policies that do not work. They've never worked in the past. They're not going to work in the future. We have to let the physicians be physicians. Let me do my job, because I promise you, if you let me do my job, we're going to save lives. And it's proven. When I saw my patients firsthand from the very get-go, we've made a difference. And that's what we need to get back to.
Let him do his job. He will save lives. I think that's a wonderful way to end our evening. With all the fear, obfuscation, and strife we're seeing in this world tonight, we've been gifted with the company of those who are putting it all on the line for truth. This is an incredibly powerful evening, an incredibly informative and eloquent program that you delivered. Gentlemen, we thank you, and we wish you Godspeed in your journey towards truth in medicine.